So this is a request to anybody out there that's young Earth to help me develop this argument against old Earth. Let me read you something about the early church fathers and some of the arguments they used to battle against those who thought the Christian idea of a physical resurrection of the dead was a impossible idea. It's still reflected in the philosophical journal or journals today about philosophical problems with different views of resurrection from the Christian perspective. So let me just read this and then maybe get your head wrapped around what I'm saying. The earliest patristic writers recognized that the dualistic anthropology of Gnosticism, which posits a conflict between the body and the soul, originates in a defective understanding of God and of his creative acts. As a result, it was suggested that God was either unwilling or unable to raise the dead. So the possibility and reality of the bodily resurrection was denied by heretical groups, such as Gnostics, and by those who held the pagan Greek ontology, which posited the eternity of matter. This idea was attacked by the patristic writers. Tatian asserted that matter is not without beginning like God, nor because of having beginning is it also of equal power with God. It was originated, brought into being by none other, rejected by the sole creator of all that is. For this same reason, we are convinced that there will be a bodily resurrection after the universe has come to an end. In a society imbued with the ideas of Platonism, the idea of a bodily resurrection was considered absurd or impossible. Since the resurrection is pivotal for the whole Christian faith, 1 Corinthians 15, 13 through 19, it was essential for the patristic writers to defend this doctrine against both heretics and pagans. However, the way in which the general resurrection was treated in the apostolic fathers indicates that before the advent of the major heresies and before the development of systematic treatments of Christian doctrine, it was not perceived to be problematic among the Christian community. According to Duarte, resurrection is not in itself often a focus of discussion, and where it does occur, it is subordinated to other concerns. Exhortations to the Christian life, rejection of ascetic Christology, or expectation of the millennial reign of Christ, the characteristically Pauline causal link between Christ's resurrection and the hoped for by his followers receives relatively little attention. Because the resurrection was denied on the basis of a competing cosmogony and ontology, only by asserting an alternative ontology rooted in the Christian doctrine of creation could belief in the resurrection be defended. In addition, consideration of anthropological issues was necessary, as the origin and nature of both soul and body were under dispute. The Christian doctrine of creation was foundational for patristic theology, which emphasized the integrity of the creation as coming from the hand of the one creator God, the Father Jesus Christ, who thus also redeems that which he has created. Many patristic writers argued that if it was possible for God to bring into being that which had once not existed, then it is possible and easier for God to restore to being that which once had existed, namely persons. For instance, Minicius Felix argued that the best evidence for the, I've never heard of that guy, except for from this fair, evidence for the resurrection is found not in the ideas of the philosophers, but in the belief that God created the world. And if God was able to create the world in the beginning, he is certainly able to recreate human bodies again. His protagonist, Octavius, does not simply state that recreation is as simple as original creation. He also sees a parallel between non-existence before birth and non-existence after death. Just as the original creation came from nothing, so too we are recreated from nothingness into which we entered on death. This exactly answers the comments of his opponent, Caecilius, that before we are born, we do not exist, and when we die, we perish. Octavius, while agreeing with these statements, turns them to support his own doctrine, arguing that, therefore, any future life must involve a resurrection, and that God is both willing and able to raise us from the dead. What God had originally created from nothing, he could easily recreate again from the dust. Since God had created humankind as bodily beings, it was only logical that it would be as bodily beings that we would be recreated. This then entailed a bodily resurrection of the dead. Creation of Adam from dust is a frequently used analogy, since Adam and all his descendants returned to dust again as a result of sin. The creative power of God guarantees the resurrection of the dead. Just as Adam was created from the dust in the beginning, the apostolic constitutions express this analogy very concisely to illustrate the resurrection. For he that made the body of Adam out of the earth will raise up the bodies of the rest, and that of the first man, after their dissolution, to pay what is owing to the rational nature of man. We mean the continuance in being through all ages. He, therefore, who brings on the dissolution will himself procure the resurrection. And he that said, the Lord took dust from the ground and formed man, and breathed into his face the breath of life, and man became a living soul, added after the disobedience, you are earth, and unto earth you shall return. The same promised us a resurrection afterwards. The argument that the possibility and certainty of the resurrection is ensured by God's creative power was used in various forms by writers throughout the patristic period. In defending their belief in the bodily resurrection on the basis of the creation, the patristic writers often use analogies taken from everyday experience or images found in the stories in Scripture, although Scripture does not often itself connect these images with the resurrection, rather than by exegeting the text of Scripture itself. So they were pulling the old Lazarus Calvinist argument, the misuse of biblical imagery. No, I'm just kidding. Kind of. Oh, I'm not really kidding. It's not a good idea. Such analogies were used by the apologists in order to demonstrate the resurrection to pagans on a basis they would understand. And these analogies, in other words, and these analogies became commonplace in patristic texts. In the apostolic constitutions, many of these analogies are gathered together in one passage. Let's see. Okay. And he that raised himself from the dead will also raise again all that are laid down. He who raises wheat out of the ground with many stalks from one grain. He who makes the tree that is cut down send forth fresh branches. He that made Aaron's dry rod put forth buds will raise us up in glory. He that raised him up, that had the palsy whole, and healed him that had the withered hand. He that supplied a defective pot to him was born blind with clay and spittle, will raise us up. He that satisfied 5,000 men with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and caused a remainder of 12 baskets, and out of water made wine, and sent a piece of money out of the fish's mouth. By me, Peter, to those that demanded tribute, will raise the dead. Another analogy frequently used is the story of the phoenix, a bird which is supposedly raised from the dead. If a mere bird is raised, surely human beings will be raised. The first time we meet the example of the phoenix is in Clement of Rome, who says, do we then deem it any great and wonderful thing for the maker of all things to raise up again those who have piously served him? In assurance of a good faith, when even by a bird, the phoenix, he shows us the mightiest of his power to fulfill his promise. The patristic writers claim that because this story from pagan sources speaks of the resurrection, therefore such a belief is not absurd, since the pagans have themselves accepted the possibility in their own tradition. For instance, Cyril of Jerusalem uses the example of the phoenix as a proof that the Greeks believe in the resurrection of a bird, which is no more incredible than the resurrection of human beings. There are several variations of the myth of the phoenix. In one, the old bird flies to Egypt, where it burns itself on a funeral pyre, from which the new bird arises. In another, the bird dies elsewhere, and out of the decaying carcass the new bird develops, which then flies to Egypt with the carcass and burns it on a funeral pyre. Cyril adopted this latter version, possibly for apologetic reasons, since it placed emphasis on the identity of the old bird and the new phoenix. which is what I would argue Paul does with and Job, seems to be important. So the identity of the resurrection body. The most important issue for the patristic writers with respect to the resurrected body, or to the resurrection body, was its identity with the body in this life. As the soul will return to its own body at the resurrection and not to some other body, this is interesting. Let our own people, moreover, bear this in mind, that souls are to receive back at the resurrection the self-same bodies in which they died. Therefore, our bodies must be expected to resume the same condition and the same ages. For it is these particulars which impart to bodies their special modes. This view is frequently expressed by patristic writers in their polemic against the transmigration of souls, metempsychosis or reincarnation, metempsychosis or reincarnation. They argued that it is no more possible or logical for a soul to enter another body than to have its own body restored to it. Well, the whole idea of transmigration is contrary to Christian belief. The adoption of an anthropological dichotomy permits such a possibility to be considered. An anthropological model in which human nature was conceived as a whole without any dichotomy precludes the very possibility of a transmigration of the soul. According to Tertullian, false religion is correlated with the denial that at the resurrection each soul is clothed again with the body it laid aside at death. That is, the resurrection body must be a body of flesh for identity to be maintained, which refutes Gnostic and other heresies which deny that there is any possibility of salvation for the flesh. In the creedal formulation concerning the resurrection, the alternatives of the resurrection of the dead or the resurrection of the body could equally well have been used. Gregory the Illuminator speaks of the resurrection of the flesh from the dead, while Cyril of Jerusalem says that my present remarks concerning resurrection of the dead have been made with reference to the article in the resurrection of the flesh. However, there is apparently dogmatic significance in what appears to have been a preference for the phrase the resurrection of the flesh, carnis resurrectionem. Holland argues that the phrase mortuorum resurrectionem would have been more appropriate, as with the use of anastasis, necron, in the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. But this peculiar phrase is obviously polemical, as Marcion and the Gnostics would be unable to confess the resurrection of the flesh because of their dualistic theologies. And so the phrase reflects the struggle against the Gnostics. But as Wazink argues, one of the problems of this formulation was it does not reflect the terminology used in Scripture. And so writers such as Tertullian restored to allegorical interpretations, which he maintained refer to the resurrection. Wazink cites a passage from Tertullian on the resurrection of the flesh, where he deals with this issue. So if allegorical passages and significant actions and simple language throw light on the resurrection of the flesh, even though the topic itself is not mentioned, how much more determinative are those which actually mention it? Wazink states that Tertullian thought the image of garments in Scripture, e.g. Matthew 22:11 and Revelation 3:5, what about Revelation 19, may be interpreted allegorically as indications of the resurrection. I don't know about that. While Tertullian was not opposed to allegory as such, he objected to any hermeneutical approach which diminished the reality of the resurrection body and rejected any attempt to interpret the resurrection of the flesh allegorically. Since the resurrection body would retain its identity with the body in this life, the reconstitution of the body, which had disintegrated in death, was a problem. Would the very same particles of matter be used to form the new body? If not, wherein lays the identity? In this connection, we find a number of patristic writers' consideration of the problem of chain consumption. Athenagoras is the first to discuss it in detail and provides a theoretical solution. One stimulus to discussing this problem is the charge that Christians engaged in cannibalism. However, Athenagoras argues that an ethical viewpoint, that someone who believed in the resurrection of the body, would never stoop to eating another human body. What man who believes in a resurrection would offer himself as a tomb for bodies destined to rise? For it is impossible at the one and the same time to believe that our bodies will arise and then eat them as though they will not arise, or to think that the earth will yield up its dead and then suppose that those whom a man has buried within himself will not reclaim their bodies. Oh dear. Athenagoras also refers to the physiological view that only the natural food of an animal can be digested by it. So therefore, cannibalism does not result in that the flesh becoming part of the animal. You will just pass it along and give it back. For Athenagoras, this is correlated with the ethical views, since on both grounds, human flesh is not the proper. All food's made clean, brother. All food's made clean. Don't put me under that law. I can eat my brethren if I wish. Thank you very much. Don't you put me under that law. No cannibalism, I said. I said all food made clean. Pickled man's feet for brunch. Sounds awfully tempting.